Hello guys, and welcome back to this new video. Today we are going to talk about Sarah Baartman. Now, this is a woman that we might have seen several times without fully understanding who she was. There are several cartoons of that time that portray her in a certain way, so we might have seen her around. Lately I saw it in a post from El País, the newspaper El País, but there was no mention of her, and I thought it was important, and it was extremely important culturally to understand who she was, what she did, and why she's so meaningful and impactful. Sarah Baartman was probably an orphan, and she was a woman working in South Africa. She was free, but basically working around the late 19th century as a slave, or pretty much in the same conditions of a slave. This woman worked as a domestic, worked as a house servant in South Africa for a British doctor, William Dunlop. And William Dunlop, along with a mixed race entrepreneur, Hendrik Caesar, kidnapped her. What actually happened is that she signed under false pretenses a contract saying that she was going to be shipped to Europe, and she was. She probably had 2 kids with a Dutch soldier. The 2 kids, anyway, were separated from her. She embarked on a journey and spent some of her life in London and Paris. When she arrived in Europe, she was a huge attraction, and that was exactly the reason behind those 2 men shipping her to Europe. She was a black woman. She had an important size, but most of all, what was so particular about her, which wasn't necessarily typical of her and only her, but typical of some women of color, we could also say, was what we now call with the term saberpedia, which is basically built up fat around the derriere. So basically the buttocks look very broad and very large, and that wasn't a trait that was specifically of this woman and only this woman, but this woman was chosen probably because they knew her as she was working again for one of them. She was shipped to Europe. Now, when she came to Europe, she didn't have a very easy life because she was paraded in freak shows. She would wear skin-tight, flesh-colored clothing, beads, feathers, and also smoke a pipe. She was never completely naked, but we do know that she worked, or she was forced to work as a prostitute. We also know that she died of eruptive disease, which would be classified as pneumonia, syphilis, and alcoholism, and she was only 26 when she died. She was for the longest time ever in London, working in freak shows, and then in Paris doing pretty much the same thing. She was at the time known as the Hottentot Venus, but Hottentot became a very denigratory term by the Dutch, because Hottentot is exactly how Dutch would refer to koi and san, again in a denigratory, disparaging way. And we also know of this woman that she was preserved, at least her remains, or some of her remains were preserved, as the skeleton was preserved, and also her brain and her genitals were pickled. And the guy that did that was George Cuvier. And George Cuvier basically preserved those remains until I think 2002, yes, when the remains were finally returned to South Africa. And Cuvier was also the guy that basically initially was just interested in this woman, in the remains, in analyzing the remains of this woman, but then later on used his so-called discoveries to postulate the theory that would be the central theory of the late 19th century and 20th century, postulating inferiority of the race, of the black people against the white people. And I thought that this was such an important story. First of all, because nowadays we do know there are research that show that what is very attractive, and one of the reasons why we can explain the attraction especially that men have to the buttocks of women, is the curvilinear spine. So in other words, a certain spine that has a certain angle that will make the butt look in a certain way is perceived very attractive, scientifically speaking, by men. And so that seems to be an evolutionary trait that was just selected that way. But also, besides what we know in scientific terms, this story of Sarah Baartman has so many implications, because she was literally kidnapped. You can't really say that she gave them her consent. She probably didn't even know if that really happened. She probably didn't even know what that would entail. We don't know fully the reasons why they did that. We do know there was a particular time, because in England in 1807 was passed something called a Slave Trade Act, which was basically an act through which England finished the trade of slaves. That doesn't mean though that there were no slaves. That means that slaves could not be traded any longer. And the fact that this story just frames itself in this sort of scenario where on the one hand we have no more slave trades, and on the other hand we do have still slaves, and we are crossing that period of time that then will lead us into superiority and inferiority race complexes and theories, right, is particularly relevant, especially in hindsight, because nowadays we do know that there is also something like plastic surgeries that some people want, some people have on their butt to look in a certain way. And though, and do not misunderstand me, like this features, this trait of hers was attractive to men and probably women, the thing that was more interesting to them was just the fact that this was so exotic and so foreigner to their eyes. And so again, it's the idea that whoever doesn't look like us should be discriminated on the basis of having or not having certain traits. And this is just to put it mildly. Anyway, the considerations are multiple, because again, one of the main criteria today is to have a certain butt looking a certain way, so much so we resort to plastic surgery, which to me is quite interesting, right? Now, on the one hand, we have a woman that has a congenital trait, you know, her butt will look that way naturally anyway. And then in this picture of El País that you can guys also check, this picture of this woman that was made a prostitute was associated, put next to that of Kim Kardashian, which to me is now kind of the same thing. It just shows that they had no idea of who that woman was, but that's my personal opinion. I might be wrong on that. I also wanted to tell you that the two guys that actually shipped her were prosecuted but never convicted. That is for the record. Prosecuted but never convicted, which means basically that it was still perceived as kind of legal to do that. And her remains were for the longest time ever in Paris and were returned in South Africa only very much later on, which again, why a country would advocate for themselves the right to keep the remains of a body it's not theirs, and why they would not return it, it just doesn't make too much sense to me. But anyway, I thought it was just important to remember her. And guys, please don't forget to comment below, because I do really want to know your opinion on this story. So don't forget to like the video if you have enjoyed it, to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and of course don't forget to comment here below. We'll talk some more next time in a new video. Bye!